In the dead of winter, the world can feel like a place where time slows and isolation takes hold. Snow muffles sound, nights stretch endlessly, and the cold seems to seep into your very soul. Such was the setting of the fateful events in a small town called Hollow Pines, a remote village blanketed by perpetual snow, where an ancient evil had slumbered beneath the ice for centuries. The story begins with a newcomer, Alice, a young journalist sent to investigate the strange disappearance of a research team studying permafrost changes on the outskirts of the town. She arrived on the coldest night of the year, when the temperature plummeted so low that the air burned her lungs. The streets of Hollow Pines were nearly empty, save for the occasional shadow slipping from one warm-lit window to the next. The residents avoided her questions, their tight-lipped responses a stark contrast to the endless whisper of the wind through the trees. Alice's inquiries led her to a crumbling inn on the edge of the woods, run by a frail old woman named Marla. Marla reluctantly offered her a room, warning her not to wander after dark. The last thing Alice saw before retreating to her room was Marla bolting the doors and windows with more locks than seemed necessary, her trembling hands betraying an undercurrent of fear. That night, Alice couldn't sleep. The silence outside was unnervingly complete, broken only by the occasional groan of old wood settling in the bitter cold. As she lay awake, she thought she heard faint cries in the distance. Pulling her thick coat tightly around her, she stepped onto the frosty balcony to listen. The sound was faint but distinct, screams carried on the wind, distant but filled with a terror that made her skin crawl. Against her better judgment, she decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a scarf pulled up to shield her face from the cutting wind, Alice trudged through the snow toward the edge of town where the woods began. She followed the sound, though it ebbed and flowed like a tide, always seeming just out of reach. As she ventured deeper into the trees, the darkness became oppressive, her flashlight beam a narrow lifeline against the shadows that crept closer with every step. Her breath came in short, visible bursts, the cold gnawing at her exposed skin. Then she found it, a circle of blackened, broken trees, their branches clawing upward like skeletal fingers. At the center, a pit had been carved into the frozen earth, its edges jagged and unnatural. The cries had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence that pressed down on her like a weight. She shone her flashlight into the pit, its beam swallowed by an inky void that seemed to writhe and shimmer, as if alive. Before she could react, a sound rose from the pit, a low, guttural moan that escalated into a bone-chilling wail. Alice stumbled back, her flashlight flickering, her heart racing as shadows began to spill from the pit like smoke, moving unnaturally fast. She turned and ran, the crunch of her boots on snow drowned out by the sound of something massive and unseen pursuing her. She barely made it back to the inn, her throat raw from the icy air and the screams she hadn't realized were her own. Marla was waiting for her, her face pale and tight with worry. The old woman didn't ask where Alice had been. Instead, she shoved a hot drink into her hands and bolted the door behind her. "The pit," Marla said finally, her voice trembling. "You saw it, didn't you? It's awake now." Alice demanded answers, but Marla offered little explanation. "The pit had always been there," she said, long before the town. The research team had unearthed something they shouldn't have, disturbing whatever dark force had been sealed beneath the ice. That night, the village was besieged by horrors. Shadows moved with impossible speed, slithering through cracks and under doors, dragging screaming villagers into the night. Alice fought to keep her terror in check as the shadows clawed at the windows, their forms twisting and writhing as if they were alive. Marla chanted in a language Alice didn't recognize, her trembling voice barely audible over the howling wind. As dawn approached, the attacks ceased, leaving the village eerily quiet. Alice emerged to find the streets littered with fragments of ice and bloodstains that melted into the snow. Half the village was gone, their houses standing empty like hollow shells. Determined to stop the terror, Alice and the remaining villagers devised a desperate plan. They would return to the pit, armed with fire and faith, to seal whatever had been unleashed. The journey there was harrowing. The closer they came to the pit, the colder the air grew, the frost biting at their skin like needles. When they arrived, the pit was alive with shadows, writhing and screaming as if in agony. The villagers began their ritual, throwing oil and fire into the pit, chanting prayers to gods they had long forgotten. The shadows screamed and lashed out, their touch freezing the flesh of those who dared stand too close. One by one, the villagers fell, their bodies consumed by the darkness. In the end, it was Alice who stepped forward, clutching a bundle of dynamite they had salvaged from an old mine. With trembling hands, she lit the fuse and hurled it into the pit. There was a deafening roar, a blinding light, and then silence. When she awoke, the pit was gone, replaced by a smooth sheet of ice. The village was in ruins, its few survivors too broken to speak of what had happened. Alice left Hollow Pines that same day, vowing never to return. But even now, she dreams of the shadows, their whispers haunting her no matter how far she runs. Some say the pit is still out there, buried beneath the snow, waiting for the next fool to stumble upon it. And in the stillness of a winter night, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of screams carried on the wind. The winter wind howled through the abandoned mining town of Black Hollow, a ghostly place nestled deep within the Rocky Mountains. Few dared to venture there, especially in the dead of winter. But desperation had driven Ethan Carter, a seasoned hunter, seek shelter in the desolate town as a blizzard closed in, swallowing the forest in an impenetrable white veil. The town had been abandoned decades ago after a series of unexplained deaths. Miners had vanished deep within the labyrinth of tunnels, their screams echoing to the surface. Those who managed to escape the mines spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers that seemed to come from the frozen earth itself. The mine was sealed, and the town slowly faded into memory, leaving behind only rotting buildings and a legacy of fear. Ethan, oblivious to the town's grim history, stumbled into the hollow just as night fell. The air was unnaturally cold, biting through his layers and clinging to his skin like a second, icy breath. He found refuge in a decaying saloon, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of time and snow. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and though it seemed unused for years, Ethan managed to coax a small fire to life. The warmth was a fragile comfort. The silence of the town was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant wail of the wind. As Ethan prepared to rest, he heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of boots crunching on snow. He froze, his ears straining against the suffocating quiet. The sound grew louder, circling the saloon. Ethan called out, his voice cracking, but there was no response. Gripping his hunting rifle, Ethan crept to the window and peered outside. The snow-covered street was empty, but the footprints were fresh, leading directly to the saloon before vanishing into the blizzard. Uneasy, Ethan bolted the doors and returned to his fire, though sleep was impossible. The hours stretched on, the wind's mournful cries seeping into his bones. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs, but they grew louder, more insistent, as though many voices were speaking at once. Ethan's pulse quickened. The sound wasn't coming from outside, but beneath him. He stood, his breath clouding in the frigid air, and noticed the floorboards vibrating slightly, as though something massive stirred below. The whispers turned to moans, then to screams. Ethan scrambled to the door, throwing it open and plunging into the snow. The blizzard swallowed him whole, the saloon's faint glow quickly fading behind him. He ran blindly, his boots sinking into the drifts, until he found himself in the town square. There, at the heart of the hollow, he saw it. The mine's entrance, a gaping maw rimmed with frost, its old boards shattered as if something had forced its way out. Ethan turned to run, but the shadows around him shifted. They slithered across the snow, rising and coalescing into impossible forms. Tall, elongated figures with featureless faces that glowed faintly in the darkness. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were puppets manipulated by an unseen force. One stepped closer and Ethan raised his rifle, firing a single shot. The bullet passed through the figure as if through smoke, but the thing did not stop. It reached for him, its long, spindly fingers stretching toward his chest. As its touch brushed against him, a wave of freezing pain shot through his body and his vision blurred. He stumbled back, falling into the snow. The whispers surged in his mind, filling his thoughts with images of the miners, trapped in the dark, clawing at the walls as the shadows consumed them. He could hear their screams, feel their terror as though their memories had been burned into his soul. Summoning what little strength he had, Ethan rose and ran, his breath ragged and his body numb. The figures did not follow, but their whispers lingered, a constant presence that gnawed at his sanity. He fled the town, the snow blinding him as he retraced his path through the forest. The shadows seemed to stalk him, their forms flickering just at the edges of his vision. When the blizzard finally broke at dawn, Ethan stumbled into a ranger station miles away, his face pale and his eyes hollow. He tried to explain what he had seen, but his words came out in fragments, incoherent ramblings about shadows, screams, and the mine. The Rangers found his story unbelievable, chalking it up to hypothermia and exhaustion. Months later, a team of researchers decided to investigate Black Hollow, drawn by tales of its mysterious past. They never returned. The search party that went after them found no bodies, only scattered footprints leading to the mine. The entrance had resealed itself, and the air around it was unnaturally cold. Ethan's story remains a warning, a chilling tale told around campfires in the dead of winter. Some claim to have heard the whispers near Black Hollow, faint voices carried on the wind. And on the coldest nights, when the world is silent and the snow falls heavy, they say you can see the shadows moving, waiting for their next victim to wander too close. In the remote Alaskan wilderness, where winter nights stretched endlessly and the aurora borealis danced like ghostly fire, the cabin sat alone. It was an old trapper's hut, forgotten by time, nestled deep in the woods. Few knew of its existence, and fewer still dared to venture there. The locals whispered of the Winterborn, a curse said to plague those who disturbed the ancient stillness of the forest. Kara didn't believe in curses. A seasoned wildlife photographer, she had come to the area to capture images of the elusive Arctic fox. The cabin, though run down, offered shelter from the biting cold and a vantage point for her work. She arrived in the early afternoon, the sun already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-draped landscape. The first thing Kara noticed was the unnatural quiet. Even in the dead of winter, that there should have been the sound of branches creaking under the weight of snow or the faint rustle of wind through the trees. But here there was nothing, just a silence so profound it pressed against her ears like a heavy weight. As she unpacked, she found strange carvings on the walls, symbols etched deep into the wood. They looked like runes, unfamiliar and jagged, spiraling into shapes that made her stomach twist. Someone had scrawled warnings in faded red paint. Leave. They wake when it grows dark. She dismissed the markings as the work of paranoid hunters or pranksters, though a small knot of unease settled in her chest. By the time she finished unpacking her gear, night had fallen, and the forest was bathed in silver light from the full moon. Kara lit the old cast-iron stove and settled in, her camera ready by the window. Hours passed, and the unease grew. Outside, the aurora shimmered like a curtain of green and gold light, but Kara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At first, she chalked it up to paranoia, the isolation playing tricks on her mind. Then she saw the footprints. They appeared in the snow just beyond the clearing, far from where any person should have been. Bare footprints, as if someone had walked through the snow without shoes. They were large, human-like but elongated, with clawed toes. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the tree line, as if their maker had simply vanished. Kara's pulse quickened. She locked the door and drew the curtains, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. But then came the scratching. It started faintly, like the sound of branches brushing against the walls, but it grew louder, more insistent. Kara froze as the noise moved around the cabin, circling it, pausing at the windows before continuing. Her flashlight revealed nothing outside but the undisturbed snow. And then she heard it, a voice, faint and whispery, calling her name. Kara. Her blood ran cold. The voice was distorted, unnatural, but unmistakably human. She pressed herself against the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice came again, closer this time. Kara, come outside. It was impossible. No one knew she was there. Her satellite phone sat on the table, its screen cracked from an earlier fall, rendering it useless. She clutched her hunting knife, the only weapon she had, as the voice continued to call her name, each repetition dripping with malice. The scratching turned to banging, the door shuddering under the force. Kara stumbled back as the old wood creaked, threatening to splinter. She didn't wait to see what was on the other side. Grabbing her coat and boots, she climbed out through the small back window, landing silently in the snow. The air was bitterly cold, but she didn't feel it. Panic drove her forward, her feet crunching through the snow as she sprinted toward the tree line. Behind her, the banging stopped. The silence was worse. The forest closed around her, its shadows deep and oppressive. She ran blindly, her flashlight casting erratic beams of light, and then she heard it, the sound of something following her. Not footsteps, but the unmistakable crunch of snow being disturbed, slow and deliberate. She turned, her light catching a glimpse of it, a tall, emaciated figure, its skin pale as frost and stretched tight over jagged bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth was filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. It moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking as though it didn't quite understand how to use them. Kara ran faster, her lungs burning from the cold. The thing gave chase, its movements eerily silent. She tripped, falling face first into the snow. When she looked up, it was standing over her, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its mouth opened and a guttural, inhuman sound emerged, a low growl that turned into a piercing shriek. Kara scrambled backward, reaching for her knife, but the creature didn't attack. Instead, it leaned closer, its breath a cloud of frost as it whispered in a voice that wasn't its own. "Kara, we've been waiting." Before she could react, it lunged. She slashed wildly with the knife, the blade sinking into its icy flesh. The creature screamed, its form flickering like a dying flame before it dissolved into a swirling mist. The mist hung in the air for a moment, then seeped into the ground, leaving no trace of the creature. Shaking, Kara stumbled back toward the cabin, but when she arrived, it was gone. Nothing but an empty clearing where it had once stood. Her equipment, her supplies, everything had vanished. She was left alone in the endless snow, the forest silent once more. They found her days later, wandering aimlessly along a frozen river, frostbitten and half-mad. She spoke of voices and shadows, of something ancient and hungry that lived in the forest. Most dismissed her as delirious, her story another legend to frighten travelers. But deep in the woods where the snow never melts and the silence is absolute, the winterborn still wait, their icy whispers carried on the wind, and those who hear their call are never the same again. The winter of 1987 was one of the coldest on record in the small town of Cedar Ridge. The snow came early that year, burying the streets under thick drifts and turning the dense woods surrounding the town into a frozen labyrinth. Amid this unforgiving landscape stood the old St. Clair Orphanage, an imposing Victorian mansion that had been abandoned for decades. Locals called it the Cold Hearth, a place where warmth and light never lingered. No one could explain why the orphanage had closed so suddenly in the 1940s. Some claimed the headmistress had gone mad and poisoned the children. Others whispered about strange sightings, children staring out from the frosted windows long after the building was supposed to be empty, or ghostly laughter echoing from its icy halls. 3 teenagers, Lila, Jake, and Ben, decided to test their courage one night during that long, bitter winter. They'd heard the stories, of course, but boredom and bravado often overpowered common sense. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and a bottle of cheap whiskey to keep warm, they trudged through the snow toward the orphanage. The building loomed above them, its peaked roof and shattered windows stark against the moonlit sky. The air around it seemed colder than anywhere else, a biting chill that gnawed at their exposed skin. The front door hung askew, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. Jake laughed nervously and stepped inside, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The others followed. The interior was worse than they imagined. The floors were warped, the walls peeling, and an eerie stillness permeated the space. Their flashlights revealed scattered toys, tiny shoes, and furniture draped in frost. In one corner of the room was a blackened hearth, its bricks crumbling. Lila shivered as she noticed something odd. Though the room was freezing, she could see no condensation from her breath. "Let's check upstairs," Jake said, his voice too loud in the silence. The staircase groaned under their weight as they ascended, their flashlights casting jagged shadows on the walls. They passed door after door, each leading to empty rooms filled with broken beds and frost-rimed furniture. But it was the end of the hallway that caught their attention, a door slightly ajar, revealing a soft glow of flickering light. "Is someone here?" Lila whispered, her voice trembling. They approached cautiously. Ben pushed the door open to reveal what had once been a nursery. A small fireplace burned in the corner, its flames weak and blue, casting an unnatural light over the room. Against the far wall stood a row of cribs, their bars twisted as if by some great force. Lila gasped as she noticed movement inside one of them. Jake stepped closer, his flashlight beam trembling. There in the crib, lay a doll, its porcelain face cracked, its glassy eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. But then it moved, its head jerking sharply toward him. The doll's mouth opened, and from it came a sound that didn't belong in this world. A child's laughter, distorted and echoing, as if played backward on a broken record. Jake dropped the flashlight with a shout, the beam spinning wildly across the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple and stretch, forming shapes, faces, too grotesque to comprehend. The laughter grew louder, joined by the faint sound of children singing. The words were indistinct, but the melody was sharp and shrill, digging into their ears like shards of ice. "Get out!" Lila screamed, grabbing Jake and Ben. The three bolted from the room, their footsteps pounding down the stairs. But the house seemed to shift around them, the hallway stretching impossibly long. The sound of tiny footsteps echoed behind them, faster and faster, as if something was giving chase. They burst out into the snow, gasping for breath, the air outside somehow warmer than the icy dread they had left behind. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the woods. When they turned back, the orphanage was dark again, its windows empty and lifeless. That night, none of them slept. They couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and each swore they heard faint whispers outside their windows, voices of children calling their names. The next day, Ben went back to retrieve the camera he had dropped in their escape. Lila and Jake refused to join him. He promised he would be quick, but hours passed, and Ben never returned. The police searched the orphanage, but found no sign of him. They did, however, find the camera lying in the snow near the front steps. The photos developed from it chilled everyone who saw them. They showed the three teens inside the house, pale and frightened, but in each frame, they weren't alone. Shadowy figures surrounded them, thin, gaunt children with hollow eyes and frostbitten faces. In the final photo, Ben stood at the nursery door, a pair of bony hands reaching out from the darkness to pull him inside. Ben was never found. Lila and Jake left Cedar Ridge soon after, plagued by nightmares for the rest of their lives. The orphanage still stands, its blackened hearth cold as ever. Locals avoid it, but some claim that on winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the wind dies down, you can hear it, the faint sound of children singing, their voices carried on the icy air. And if you're foolish enough to draw near, you might even see them, their pale faces pressed against the glass, waiting for the next visitor to join their frozen family. In the desolate tundra of northern Siberia, where temperatures plunged to inhuman depths and the sun barely kissed the horizon during winter, there was a village called Korjhov. The villagers were hardy folk, accustomed to harsh conditions, but even they whispered of something darker than the cold. They spoke of the shadow frost, a deadly phenomenon said to consume those who dared wander too far from the safety of the village after dark. Mila, a skeptical young scientist, had heard these stories when she arrived to study the region's climate anomalies. Her focus was the strange, sudden drops in temperature that were rumored to turn living things into brittle statues of ice. The villagers warned her against venturing into the tundra alone, but science demanded answers. She dismissed the tales as superstition. The day of her expedition was clear, the air sharp and dry. Accompanied by her colleague Victor, she set out on snowmobiles, deck loaded with equipment to measure temperature shifts and atmospheric pressure. The villagers watched them go, their faces grim. As Mila waved, an old woman called after her in Russian, "Beware the frost that whispers." The warning unsettled her, but she didn't let it show. By mid-afternoon, they were miles from the village, surrounded by a featureless expanse of white. The horizon blurred between the snow-covered ground and the pale gray sky. They found a suitable spot to set up their instruments, and the work kept them busy until dusk. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted rapidly. Victor checked his thermometer and frowned. "This can't be right," he muttered. "It's dropping too fast." Mila looked at the readings. The air had gone from frigid to deadly in minutes. The snow around them seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow, as if it were alive. A strange sound drifted across the tundra, a faint, high-pitched hum that sent shivers down Mila's spine. "Do you hear that?" Victor asked, his voice tight with unease. Before Mila could answer, the hum grew louder, joined by a whispering chorus. It was soft at first, like the rustle of distant leaves, but there were no trees here. The whispers grew distinct, forming words in a language Mila didn't understand. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the icy wind. Then the shadows appeared. At first, Mila thought they were tricks of the failing light, elongated shapes stretching across the snow, but they moved independently, slithering across the ground like liquid darkness. One brushed against her boot, and she gasped as a biting cold shot up her leg, far worse than the ambient chill. "We need to leave," Victor said, panic rising in his voice. They scrambled to pack their gear, but the whispers became deafening, the shadows circling closer. Victor screamed, and Mila turned to see him struggling as a shadow wrapped around his arm. Frost spread rapidly from the contact point, turning his flesh gray and brittle. He shattered into 1,000 crystalline shards before her eyes, the shards vanishing into the snow as if devoured. Mila ran. She abandoned the gear, her snowmobile, everything, and bolted into the endless tundra. The shadows pursued her, their whispers turning into guttural growls. The cold was unbearable, every breath burning her lungs, every step numbing her body. In her panic, she saw it, a small, dark structure looming in the distance. It was an old outpost, long abandoned and half buried in the snow. She stumbled toward it, flinging herself inside and slamming the door shut behind her. The whispers stopped, leaving an oppressive silence. The interior was dark and suffocatingly cold, but it offered a fleeting sense of safety. Mila's flashlight revealed remnants of the outpost's former occupants, broken furniture, scattered tools, and frost-covered walls. A journal lay open on a desk, its pages frozen but legible. The last entry read, "The frost speaks. It calls our names. We cannot escape it. The cold is alive, and it hungers." A sound outside made her heart stop. The whispers had returned, muffled but insistent. The shadows pressed against the frosted windows, their forms writhing. Mila backed away, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. Then she saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was human-shaped but impossibly tall and gaunt, its skin as pale as the snow. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of icy blue. When it moved, its joints cracked like breaking ice. It didn't speak, but its presence carried a crushing weight, a sense of ancient, malevolent intelligence. Mila couldn't move, her body frozen in terror. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her, then raised one skeletal hand. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Mila's breath crystallized in the air. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat as frost crept up her body, turning her limbs rigid. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the figure leaning closer, its glowing eyes filling her vision. When the villagers found Mila's body weeks later, it was perfectly preserved, encased in a shell of ice. Her face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, her eyes wide and unseeing. They buried her in the village cemetery, but her story spread, another warning in the long, cold history of Korzhov. To this day, travelers in the tundra speak of the whispers in the frost, the shadows that follow, and the figure with the glowing eyes. They say the cold is more than just weather. It is alive, ancient, and insatiable, and once it sets its sights on you, there is no escape. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where winter storms could bury entire towns, and the howling wind carried secrets from the past, there was an abandoned coal mine known as Black Hollow. Local legends told of strange occurrences there, miners who disappeared, eerie lights seen in the shafts, and the mournful wail of what people called the Hollow Man. Few dared to go near it, especially in winter when the mine was said to be most active. But curiosity is a powerful thing. Sam, a history student with a passion for the macabre, had come to the nearby town of Coldridge to research the mine. The story that intrigued him the most was about a collapse in 1927 that had killed dozens of miners. According to town records, the bodies were never recovered, and the mine was sealed shortly after. But locals claimed that wasn't the end of it. Survivors spoke of hearing screams long after the collapse and seeing shadows that didn't belong to any living person. Despite warnings from townsfolk, Sam was determined to explore Black Hollow for himself. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a sturdy pair of boots, he ventured out on a freezing December evening. Snow fell thick and fast, muffling every sound except the crunch of his footsteps. By the time he reached the rusted entrance to the mine, night had fully fallen, and the world outside was a swirling white void. The entrance yawned before him like the mouth of some ancient beast. Sam hesitated, the weight of the darkness pressing against him, but he reminded himself that he didn't believe in ghosts. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The cold inside the mine was different, heavy and oppressive, as if the air itself carried the weight of the mountain above. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing long-abandoned equipment, rusted rails, and walls glistening with ice. The deeper he went, the more the silence began to unnerve him. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the snow-covered world outside. This was a hollow, suffocating absence of sound, as if the mine had swallowed every noise. Then came the whispering. At first, Sam thought it was the wind, a faint, sibilant murmur echoing through the tunnels. But as he paused to listen, he realized the sound had a rhythm, a cadence, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, almost pleading. "Hello?" Sam called, his voice trembling. The sound echoed down the shaft, but no reply came. Instead, the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became an unbearable cacophony. He turned to leave, but his flashlight flickered, then died, plunging him into total darkness. Panic set in as he fumbled with the flashlight, shaking it in vain. A faint light appeared further down the tunnel, not the beam of a flashlight, but a sickly green glow, pulsating like a heartbeat. Against his better judgment, Sam crept toward it, his curiosity battling his fear. As he neared the light, he saw them, figures standing motionless in the tunnel. Their forms were vague, shrouded in the same eerie green glow. At first, he thought they were shadows, but shadows didn't have faces. These did. Gaunt, hollow-eyed faces that stared at him with expressions of sorrow and rage. "Help us," one of them whispered, its voice a dry rasp that sounded like wind over gravel. Sam stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures didn't move, but the air around him grew colder, so cold it felt like needles piercing his skin. The green light dimmed, and for a moment everything was silent again. Then he heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the tunnel, growing closer. He turned and ran. The tunnel seemed endless, the walls pressing in on him as the footsteps gained on him. He dared not look back, but he felt it, a presence, massive and malevolent, bearing down on him. The whispers returned, now a chaotic symphony of voices, all screaming one word: "Run!" He burst out of the mine, collapsing into the snow outside. The world was silent again, save for his own ragged breathing. When he looked back, the entrance to the mine was dark, lifeless. But he wasn't alone. In the snow, just feet from where he lay, were footprints. They weren't his. They were too large, and they led directly to where he had fallen before stopping abruptly. Whatever had been chasing him had been inches away. Shaking, Sam scrambled to his feet and fled back to Coldridge, vowing never to return to Black Hollow. He shared his story with no one, but his experience left its mark. The nightmares began immediately, dreams of being trapped in the mine, the walls closing in, the whispers screaming in his ears. Months later, Sam received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was an old black and white photograph of the 1927 mining crew. At the center of the group stood a tall man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes Sam recognized instantly. Scrawled on the back of the photo were the words, "He watches still." Sam left Coldridge soon after, but the nightmares never stopped. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howls just right, he swears he can still hear the whispers calling his name, begging for release. No one ventures near Black Hollow anymore. The snow buries the entrance each winter, but the mine isn't silent. Those who pass close claim they hear the screams of trapped men and heavy footsteps of something that should not exist. They say, the Hollow Man walks the tunnels, back his green glow, a warning to all who dare to disturb the restless dead. In the remote Alaskan wilderness, there was a place known to the local Tlingit people as Nagiluk's Teeth. The name referred to a jagged formation of icy cliffs that jutted out over a frozen lake, resembling the maw of some ancient beast. No one lived near the area. It was said to be cursed. Hunters and explorers who ventured too close often disappeared, their bodies found weeks later, frozen solid and contorted in unnatural poses. Those few who survived returned babbling about the watchers in the ice. Anna, a wildlife photographer, knew none of this when she arrived in the region in mid-January. She was chasing the perfect shot, the ethereal glow of the northern lights reflecting off the icy cliffs. Guided by a local bush pilot named Tom, she set up camp several miles from the cliffs, the darkening sky promising a dazzling display of lights. Tom was uneasy the entire time. "I'll come back for you tomorrow morning," he said as he unloaded her gear. "But don't get too close to those cliffs. Locals say bad things happen out there." Anna waved him off with a laugh. It's just a rock formation. I'll be fine. As night fell, the aurora lit up the sky, ribbons of green and purple dancing across the darkness. Anna's camera clicked away as she captured the surreal beauty. Hours passed and the cold began to bite deeper. She decided to pack up and head back to her tent. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. The lake below the cliffs wasn't still. The ice seemed to shimmer and shift as though something moved beneath it. At first, Anna thought it was a trick of the lights, but then she saw it clearly. Shadows swimming under the ice, their shapes long and sinuous. They moved unnaturally fast, circling the center of the lake before darting toward the cliffs. Anna froze, her heart pounding. The shadows stopped abruptly, directly below her vantage point. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from the icy surface, she heard a sound, a deep, resonant groan, like the earth itself was in pain. The sound grew louder, joined by a sharp cracking noise as fissures began to spread across the ice below. Panicking, Anna turned and sprinted toward her tent, her breath steaming in the frigid air. But as she ran, the groaning sound followed her, echoing off the cliffs and growing impossibly loud. She tripped and fell into the snow, her camera skittering away. As she scrambled to her feet, she glanced back toward the lake and froze. Figures were rising from the ice. They looked human at first, but their movements were wrong, too stiff and deliberate. Their bodies were pale and glistening, their limbs elongated, and their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their faces were obscured by frost, but their hollow eyes glowed faintly with an eerie blue light. They stepped onto the snow, their movements synchronized, like dancers in a grotesque ballet. Anna didn't wait to see more. She bolted for her tent, tearing through the snow. Behind her, she could hear the crunch of footsteps, many footsteps, gaining on her. The air grew colder with each passing second, the temperature so frigid that her exposed skin burned. She dove into her tent, fumbling for her satellite phone. Her hands were trembling so badly that she could barely press the buttons. The footsteps stopped outside, and the silence was suffocating. She dared not look, but the thin fabric of the tent did little to conceal the shadows looming just beyond. Then came the whispers. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once in a language she didn't understand. The words were soft and melodic, but there was something deeply unsettling about them, as though they were being spoken backward. Anna clamped her hands over her ears, but the voices only grew louder, filling her mind with a cold so profound it felt like her skull was cracking. The tent suddenly collapsed, the poles snapping like twigs. She screamed as the figures closed in, their glowing eyes the last thing she saw before everything went black. When Tom returned the next morning, he found the campsite in ruins. Anna's tent was shredded, her gear scattered across the snow. There were no footprints leading away, only strange, deep gouges in the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged back toward the cliffs. He searched for hours, but found no sign of her. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted something out on the frozen lake. Against his better judgment, he approached the edge, where the ice glinted under the pale morning sun. Anna was there, encased in the ice. Her face was twisted in terror, her hands clawing at the frozen surface as if trying to escape. But it wasn't just her expression that horrified Tom, it was her eyes. They were wide open, glowing faintly blue, staring directly at him. Tom fled back to his plane and never spoke of what he saw. But over the years, others who dared venture near Nagiluk's teeth reported similar sights. Figures beneath the ice, glowing eyes watching from the cliffs, and the whispers that seemed to come from the very wind. The Tlingit people say the Watchers are the spirits of those claimed by the ice, cursed to linger in eternal cold. They warn travelers to stay far away from Nagiluk's teeth, especially in winter, when the spirits are said to be most restless. But some don't listen, and those who do are rarely seen again.